Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, although I suppose it still is actually afternoon, but it always feels like the depth of the night at this time of the year. So welcome to another of Marcus Ramshaw's series on the history and various aspects of the history of Beverley. Also welcome again to Daniela for her music, which always enhances these sessions. The period which Marcus is going to cover this evening, with a focus on Beverley, is one of the most turbulent in English history. It starts in 1415 on a great high point for England with the Battle of Agincourt and Henry V's victory over the French, and ends in 1520, which, as you will discover during the course of the lecture, was a particularly significant year here in Beverley itself for various reasons. On the back of your handout, you will find the information about the next one, about theatre and entertainment in medieval Beverley. Can I just point out that as from January, we shall be going back to the evening slot of starting time of 7 o'clock. Also, as usual, we welcome a donation. We suggest £5, but that's up to you. And there's a plate near the main door as you leave. So now I hand over to Marcus for his lecture entitled Unwelcome Neighbours and Unwanted Challenges, 1415 to 1520.
Thank you, Peter. Can you hear me okay? All right, well, thank you so much for coming out on, a cold, dark, I was going to say wintry night, but technically winter is on Monday, isn't it? We're actually still in autumn, but it feels like it's 9 o'clock already, isn't it? And it's only 5 p.m. And it is quite cold. I've started to put the central heating on, and hot water bottles as well. I'm going to talk to you for an hour. I really enjoyed researching this, and this is quite an exciting talk, because it's all about the Wars of the Roses, and we're going to end with a discussion about what happened to the princes in the Tower and how Beverley gets caught up in all this. It's a vast amount of things are going on in Beverley in the 15th century. The unwelcome neighbours and unwanted challenges of the title will become apparent why I've chosen that, but I actually completely missed out on a trick here. I was discussing that with the parish centre staff whilst photocopying your handouts, which you should all have. And what I should have called this talk is actually mentioned in one of the handouts. I should have called it Satellites of Satan, Beverley and the Wars of the Roses, but that might have given the wrong impression to somebody of what we were going to have a satanic thing in Beverley Minster. But that's actually from a royal document in your handout. If you turn over the second page, it says the Satellites of Satan entry of 1444. Anyway, do you all have access to a handout? That's good. There were going to be two, but unfortunately the photocopier disagreed with the second one. But anyway, so long as you've got those handouts. Right, I'll just get straight on, and there'll be a question and answer session at the end. The War of the Roses is something of a misleading title. It was not actually coined until the early 19th century by Sir Walter Scott in his book Anne of Geierstein in 1829. And Walter Scott lumped together all the civil strife that characterized the second half of the 15th century and attributed it to the dynastic struggles between the houses of York and Lancaster. By the way, actually, before I go on, I've just remembered, we are recording this, aren't we? All right, okay. If anybody sees a verger, that would be nice to know. Right, the dynastic struggles between houses of York and Lancaster, even if it had nothing to do with them. He also portrays the period of the Wars of the Roses, which are from 1455 to 1487, as one long period of continuous warfare. But this, however, was not the case. To the people of late 15th century England, this period was known as the Cousins' War. And although it had periods of dreadful bloodshed and major pitched battles, including the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil at the Battle of Towton on March the 29th, 1461, near York, when the House of York triumphs in a snow blizzard on Palm Sunday, near Sherborne and Elmet and Saxton, with probably 15 to 20,000 men being killed in one day. The 32 years of the Wars of the Roses were largely characterized by long periods of peace, interspersed with shorter period of outright civil war. In fact, the Wars of the Roses may be regarded as three separate successive wars. The first war from 1459 to 1461, when the House of York first defeats Lancaster and deposes King Henry VI, the Lancastrian king, and places the Yorkist Edward IV on the throne. The second war is from 1469 to 1471, when the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, changes sides and abandons York and successfully mounts a short-lived coup d'etat that deposes the Yorkist King Edward IV and forces him to flee to Europe in exile, and brings about the readaptation of the Lancastrian king Henry VI. Within 6 months, however, Edward IV returns from Europe with an army, landing just down the road at Ravenspur in Holderness, and not only successfully regains his throne, but mercilessly begins to wipe out almost the entire Lancastrian dynasty, including arranging the murder of ex-King Henry VI and killing in battle his only son, Prince Edward of Wales. And then finally, the Third War, from 1483 to 1487, when during Richard III's reign, stealing silently out of the shadows of Wales, a small, largely overlooked junior cadet branch of the Lancastrian dynasty, one which had largely kept out of earlier conflicts, came to defeat Richard III, the last English king to die in battle, at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. This new dynasty, under the name Tudor, in the form of Henry VII, has such a poor genealogical claim to the throne, it has to justify its kingship by marrying the most senior surviving member of the House of York, Edward IV's oldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, and thus unite both the houses of York and Lancaster. Consequently, only 10 years out of the 32 years covered by the Wars of the Roses saw any fighting. The 1460s and the 1470s were largely a period of peace. Now, I was quite pleased with myself that I managed to sum up in about 700 to 800 words a brief resume of the most bewildering, the most confusing time in English history when you're trying to work out who on earth is who, what side are they on, why did they betray them? They're meant to be their own brother and they keep betraying them. And everybody's either called Warwick or Neville or Percy or Somerset, and actually the places that the dukes of or lords of seem to have no geographical bearing to anything on the map. I mean, did Richard, Duke of Gloucester, ever go to Gloucester? You know, Somerset and Salisbury. Did the Earl of Salisbury, was he ever down in Salisbury? So this is an incredibly confusing period. So much so that I got 2 books to recommend to you. The best up-to-date history is by Michael Hicks, The Wars of the Roses, which was only published in about 2000. And that's a really good, recent, easy-to-follow study of the Wars of the Roses and the leading scholarship. But as we all know, I am a big believer in dictionaries. Dictionaries of Latin and dictionaries of medieval history and dictionaries of European medieval history and dictionaries of this and that, dictionaries of theology. There was actually an encyclopedia of the Wars of the Roses alone in its own right to help you. That shows how confused this period is, when just one single war in one country merits an encyclopedia. But I do commend that to you, by John Wagner, and it's quite a recent publication, and is quite reasonably priced, I think 20 quid. So, I can only give you a brief outline and framework in tonight's talk, because the War of the Roses is a period of treachery, betrayal, and double dealing, even from within one's own household and families. Brother will betray brother. Followers will change sides for a multiplicity of reasons. And it's true that the HBOS TV series and George Martin or Marin's books, The Game of Thrones, are a fantasy retelling of the Wars of the Roses. And the similarities there are quite startling, clearly deliberate. At the heart of the Wars of the Roses, this is a battle for the throne. But there are only two houses, York and Lancaster, that have a credible, legitimate genealogical claim to the throne, as both York and Lancaster are direct descendants from the sons of King Edward III, who died in 1377. However, neither of these two powerful families can defeat each other on their own. They will need the help of other noble and baronial families. And these include the two most powerful families in Northern England, the House of Percy and the House of Neville, both of which hate each other as much, if not more, than the Montagues and the Capulets in Romeo and Juliet. Some ancient grudge, some insult, or past rivalry, the exact details now entirely forgotten by historians and probably forgotten by both families, feeds into their jealous, entrenched rivalry and ambition to dominate the north of England. And then in the Midlands, the south of England, and in Wales, there are other houses in varying power, wealth, and size. The House of Stafford, the House of Courtenay, a developing House of Woodville, the House of Beaufort, out of which comes the small House of Tudor. If either York or Lancaster can assure the control of at least a majority of these houses, then their seizure, and more importantly, their continued occupation of the throne is almost assured. But as Shakespeare says in his play about Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king, that uneasy is the head that wears the crown. There is a moral and several sermons that could come from the entire experience of the Wars of the Roses as it is. In the first instance, it is a period of mutual, royal, and noble annihilation and destruction, as almost all of England's leading nobility kill each other successfully, with some houses being wiped out altogether, to the extent that really nobody wins in the end. And in the second case, when the House of York seems to be finally triumphant with the death of Edward IV and with two healthy teenage boys in the shape of the future Edward V, the Prince of Wales, and his brother, Richard, Duke of York, the princes in the Tower, who are there to succeed and continue the Yorkist line, it is by seizing the throne in 1483 that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, their uncle, Edward IV's youngest brother, we will come onto the question of whether or not he murdered them later on at the end of the talk. Richard destroys his own dreams because Richard's actions, above all else, make the House of York implode in on itself. You might argue that the House of York destroys the House of York, and the House of Tudor picks up their discarded pieces, including the crown, from a ditch on Bosworth Field. Now, I hope I haven't lost you in any of that. You're still following me. So, I mean, obviously, it has to be a bit simplified. But as long as you're still with that lengthy, detailed background, because I am going to talk about Beverley, I promise. The Percy-Neville feud. Ironically, I'm going to go work backwards here. The peaceful period of the Wars of the Roses, the 1460s, especially, were probably more peaceful than the 10 or 20 years that preceded the outbreak of the wars in 1455, when Richard, Duke of York, first claims the crown openly and leads a failed abortive coup in 1455. The origins of the Wars of the Roses and the tinderbox of fiery tempers that provide both York and Lancaster with sufficient support in men, money, and estates to enter into open conflict with each other lie in northern England, and in this, Beverley will play a key part. An unexpected confusion that most people will find rather puzzling. That is, most of Yorkshire in the 40s, in the 1450s, 1460s, and early 1470s is, in fact, Lancastrian. So have a look at your handout, and you'll see a map there, which I'm afraid hasn't reproduced terribly well, but you will see the extent of Lancastrian holdings in Yorkshire. It's at the very back of your handout, in northern England. Now, hopefully, really the photocopier wasn't happy about this one at all, but you can still see that almost all the darkly shaded bits there, the area around Scarborough, large parts of Durham, all of Lancashire, bits in Yorkshire that are in fact Lancastrian, as is large parts of Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, North Wales, huge parts of Northumberland around Hexham. The lighter shaded bits, of which there really are four, which is Pontefract in Yorkshire, a bit of North Wales, most of South Wales, and a bit down in Northampton, are followers of the House of York at the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. The rest of the country is either neutral, and huge amounts of this are going to change sides. But it is a curiosity, and it does take a lot getting your head around, knowing that Yorkshire, for the first half, if not more than half, is Lancastrian. York itself, the city, hedges its bets between York and Lancaster. And much the same true of Northumberland and County Durham. The House of York is largely actually based in London. It has its headquarters in the city of London. And I said the only significant Yorkshire holding in 1545, which is Yorkist, is the powerful stronghold of Pontefract Castle. From the mid-1470s, Yorkshire will become entirely Yorkist, as Richard, Duke of Gloucester, builds up a massive power base in Yorkshire, northern England, which he rules from Middleham Castle. But by then, the House of Lancaster has been almost entirely, systematically and purposefully wiped out by Edward IV. But it is in the growing fierceness of the Percy and Neville disputes, which become a feud and then turn into rioting, sedition, false arrests. The first battle of the Wars of the Roses may be said to have started as a result of that in 1454, 1 year before the traditional historical starting date of 1455. And I should point out here that within all this, not only is Yorkshire largely Lancastrian, the Percy family are Lancastrian and remain so throughout almost the entire period. And the House of Neville begin this period also as Lancastrian, but will quickly defect over to the Yorkist side. And the confusing thing is sort of keeping sort of caught up with them, because, I mean, the Neville family will actually defect again back in the 1470s, make their own bid for the crown, and then get wiped out, and then they'll come back to York, what's left of them. And a lot of the Wars of the Roses is Edward IV is the most successful king because he knows just exactly when to be merciful and play the carrot to bring other houses and families in, even if they're being rebellious, and when to use the stick and hit the snake's head and decide to finally get rid of them. It's something that Henry VI never ever gets the hang of, and that will bring about his own downfall. But there is this battle a year before the War of the Roses starts, which is almost entirely overlooked. It's near York, and it involves at least 400 to 800 knights of the Neville and Percy families with their retainers who enter into an ambush which becomes a pitched battle. Does anybody know where it is? It is the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Stamford Bridge. Yes, you did hear me right. And I'm not talking about 1066 and all that. I grew up in Stamford Bridge between 1978 and 86. And I remember, we used to go and cook Viking pies at school on September the 25th and have a fete and all sorts of things. Everything was about the Vikings and Harald Hardrada and all that. This is the second battle of Stamford Bridge of 1453. And there is, in fact, a third battle of Stamford Bridge during the English Civil War. Stamford Bridge, 8 miles east of York, is strategically highly important for both York and the East Riding. And that is probably why 3 battles are fought there. For the defence of Yorkshire, the North Riding, if you think about it, North Riding is protected by invasion, either from Scotland or from within itself, from its own barons in Northumberland or Cumberland or Westmoreland or anywhere else, all the Vikings. North Yorkshire is protected by a ring of castles. Scarborough in the east, Helmsley, Pickering, Sheriff Hutton, Richmond and Middleham, and York itself. The East Riding does not have any significant castles at all in the late Middle Ages. There's Leconfield and there's Wrestle, but they really are fortified manor houses and not much more. It does, however, have a flipping huge moat that defines and protects its borders in the form of the River Derwent. And this can only be crossed by an invading army at specific points where there are stone bridges crossing the Derwent. And these are at Yeddingham, Malton, Stamford Bridge, Kexby Bridge, Sutton upon Derwent, and Budworth. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, fought on Halloween, October the 31st, 1454, was the most violent episode of the Percy-Neville feud, and an important factor in cementing the political alignments that would lead to the outbreak of the Civil War in the following year. It also takes place during the middle of the first protectorate of Richard, Duke of York, because what's happened, I'm afraid I can't not go back to refer to national events, because otherwise what happens here won't make any sense. But Henry VI, who's on the throne, the last Lancastrian king, has gone mad. He has literally gone insane completely. And this happens in August 1453, and he will not recover for at least another 2 years. So Richard, who is his heir, because Henry VI doesn't have any children, so genealogically, Richard, Duke of York, is next in line to the throne, becomes the regent, the Lord Protector. And this is only the first bout of insanity that Henry VI suffered, because his second madness, which will develop later, he would never, ever recover from. The precise nature of Henry's madness is unknown, but during it he was unable to speak at all, unable to recognize people, even his own family, his wife, or his courtiers, or other members. And the illness, and he slept almost all the time. He becomes melancholic and depressed, and when he's not sleeping, he spends all his time praying and only is interested in founding King's College Chapel or Eton College, or a religious devotion. The illness may well have been genetic, a genetic predisposition inherited from his maternal grandfather, King Charles VI of France. who suffered recurring bouts of madness. They were said to be triggered in Henry by shock and started immediately after he was told that the very last of England's lands in France, in Bordeaux and Gascony, had been finally taken. England had finally lost the 100 Years' War, and he literally faints in a stupor and doesn't get up for 2 years. So Richard, Duke of York, is ruling. And during this disturbance, the Percy and Neville families are developing their feud, ratcheting it up more and more and more. In June 1454, after more than a year of harassing and destroying the partisans and the property of the rival Neville family, Thomas Percy, Lord Egremont, the second son of Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland. There's so many characters, this is where it starts to get really confusing, but please do bear with me. I probably should have given you a genealogical table, but once we get past this, to be honest, it'll get a little bit easier. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, joins with Henry Holland, the Duke of Exeter, in an uprising aimed at disrupting the rule of Richard, Duke of York, and he does it in Yorkshire. Exeter claimed that he had a better right to be the regent than Duke Richard, and Egremont saw the Duke's rebellion as an opportunity to escalate his attacks on the Neville family, who were increasingly allying themselves with the House of York. Richard, Duke of York, the regent, marches north from London to quell the uprising, and Exeter fled, but was later captured and imprisoned by Richard of York. Lord Egremont, however, remained at large in Yorkshire and began recruiting followers from among the Percy tenantry. In late October, while leading a band of more than 200 Percy knights and their retainers, so it's probably about 400 to 600 people, Lord Egremont and his younger brother Richard Percy encounter a force led by Thomas and John Neville, younger sons of Richard Neville, the head of the Neville family, the Earl of Salisbury. And the two forces collide east of York at the Neville Manor of Stamford Bridge. Stamford Bridge is owned by the Neville family, almost on the site of the 1066 battle. Because most of their men seem to have fled before battle was fully engaged, Lord Egremont and his brother were both captured by the Neville forces, who carried them to their stronghold at Middleham Castle. A Neville-convened and controlled commission was established in the city of York and found that Lord Egremont was liable to Salisbury for over £11,000 in damages, a staggering sum running into tens of millions of pounds in today's money, and completely beyond the prisoner's means. And I doubt Stamford Bridge was worth that much. I very much doubt it. Because this is deliberate, and it allows the Nevilles to commit Lord Egremont and his brother to prison as a debtor in London, a confinement that will last over 2 years before they both manage to escape in November 1456. The War of the Roses isn't just about battles, it's largely about dirty tactics and finding a way that we can just either get you into debt or get you to break the law in such a way that we can have a trumped-up commission, or we can provoke you, or we can hit vicariously at another house or another family member or a friend, which will enable us to score points. In the late 1450s, the mutual hostility that manifested itself in Stamford Bridge drove the Nevilles to ally themselves permanently with York against the Percys, and the Percys will now join the court faction of Henry VI and the House of Lancaster. There's a famous thing, and I think Shakespeare does touch on it, that in a brief moment of lucidity, King Henry VI tries to reconcile the two rival parties in March 1458 in a settlement of peace in a garden, which has gone down in history, and it was called the Royal Love Day. What a lovely name, a Royal Love Day. And this was hopefully to patch up York and Lancaster, Percy and Neville. And it required Lord Egremont to give solemn promises and bonds to keep the peace, and for Salisbury and the Nevilles to drop the £11,000 fine, to embrace, to exchange gifts, and to stop the war developing any further. But by 1459, the Love Day is forgotten. Now, the antecedents to this Second Battle of Stamford Bridge lie 10 years even earlier in the borough and liberties of Beverley. And two curious documents survive from 1444 and 1445, which are in your handout, which may well powerfully illustrate the heightening tensions of the Percy and the Neville families. I have found these documents, and I've never seen them in any history at all written about the Wars of the Roses. They're in the National Archives, in the Public Record Office, in the calendars of patent rolls, and this is a fresh translation I've given to you in part, and they're just not mentioned in any book about the Wars of the Roses. So treat this as new research. And I'm still trying to work them out. Peter Wadsworth and myself have been discussing this for the past couple of weeks, what actually is really going on here. So it is that Satellites of Satan entry is the first of the two documents. Now, Beverley is principally under Percy control. Beverley Minster is almost the family mausoleum of the Percy family, and they're Lancastrian. But Beverley is, of course, under the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of York. But the Archbishop of York, during this period, John Kemp, is both Lancastrian and principally associated with the Percy family against the Nevilles, although he spends most of his time abroad on diplomatic missions. Whether the two documents that we're going to look at in your handout, the Satellites of Satan entry and the document which immediately follows it, I lost my own handout. Can I borrow a spoon? Oh, there it is. Which is a long list of names. The Beverley Rebellion of 1445, and Neville Percy dispute. Just after your map. So the first one, August the 13th, 1444, a royal commission by Henry VI was issued to Thomas Filthorpe, William Ayscough, and John Portington, setting forth that John Wighale, keeper of Nottingham Jail, and other satellites of Satan, coming of late to the town of Beverley, and bursting in upon the liberty and immunity thereof, broke by night the house of Robert Macon, who had fled thither for the immunity thereof, and dragged him from his bed and wounded him, because he refused to ride with them. They dragged him as a traitor by the pavement of the town, and through rural and devious ways by the feet, until they had escaped past the danger of the town, the danger of the inhabitants of the town, and the commissioners are to make inquisition in the counties of York and Nottingham, touching the premises, and if true, to restore Robert to the said immunity. What a wonderfully dramatic document. This poor, poor Robert. You can picture him being dragged through Wednesday Market, dragged up Highgate over the cobbles of Saturday Market to the North Bar by his feet, called a traitor at night from his bed by the satellites of Satan. Gosh, didn't I miss a trick on the title of this talk? Unwelcome Neighbours and Unwanted Challenges. I should have called it the Satellites of Satan. And a good talk title is very useful for advertising. But I think you have to agree, this is an incredibly vivid document. And I'm interested to know that the word traitor is being used. The use satellites of Satan is not mincing its own words. And it is an absolute outrage. It's completely breaking. There's no reference to the rights and privileges of the Archbishop or Beverley Minster or any claiming of sanctuary here. It's a shocking incident. It is a complete breach of the Archbishop of York's immunity. It's interesting to note the use of rural and devious ways. And also the poor Robert is possibly being dragged far away to Nottingham. Because it's clear he has not claimed sanctuary in Beverley Minster, which he could easily have done if he was guilty of a crime. I think it is clear that he hadn't committed the crime, and this act is an entirely political act under the cover of darkness. The second document, just 1 year and 1 month later, is far more disturbing for the people of Beverley. This is a truly astonishing document from the same source, the Calendar of the Patent Rolls in the National Archives. On November the 20th, you have it there, 1445, King Henry VI appointed a commission to include Ralph Greystock, Knight, John Constable, Knight, Ralph Bigod, Knight, Guy Rawcliffe, Peter Buckram, and Henry Frey, some of the leading nobility and gentry of the East Riding, to deliver to the jail of York Castle an extraordinarily long list of Beverley residents. The arrests list the names and the occupations of 72 individuals. I think actually I've put a mistake there, it's 76 individuals. Do feel free to count. They extend across a wide range of Beverley society. And there is no mention of a charge or an allegation. This is a mass arrest and roundup which breaks all the laws of the liberty of Beverley and all English law at the time. Why is this taking place? Those that are arrested include gentlemen and merchants, highly skilled craftsmen, including a goldsmith, but also carpenters, shoemakers, and cap makers, skilled workers as well as butchers, skinners and coopers, barrel makers, cooks, and labourers. It is the equivalent today, if we reflect the number of arrests to the then population, of the police coming to Beverley tomorrow morning and arresting at least 600 to 700 individuals and carting them off to jail. And note, they are being taken to York jail. Beverley has its own jail. Why didn't they go there? And there are other jails nearer, Scarborough, Helmsley, Pickering, and of course, there's Hull, much nearer. Why then take them to York unless you wanted them out of the way? And what have they done wrong? This curious cross-section. Now, I'm partly working on my own interpretation here, and Peter and I have got a couple of theories. I mean, I don't think we're 100% certain on either of them, but this is a major event. We know nothing more than this document, really. There's no particular follow-up. So it does seem clear that no one is executed, no one is fined, and there's no further evidence of any charges ever being brought against any one of these individuals, even though we do have their names and their occupations. In fact, we also, in many cases, have got their full names. It is interesting to note that really, although there's a couple of clerks and a notary referred to, none of them are a member of the clergy in the liberty of the Archbishop and in the Minster, which also has Franciscan and Dominican friaries. Is this a Neville family attack on the Percy base of Beverley, a tactic of shock and awe? It must have sent shockwaves throughout Beverley and the East Riding. It might also be seen as almost a decapitation of Beverley's internal society and hugely damage its trading activities and its feeling of protection. And although a cross-section of society is represented in this list of individuals who are arrested, the majority of them are coming from the middling sort. There are no nobles here. I made a list this morning. There are 3 gentlemen, 4 merchants, 2 shipmasters, 11 yeomen, 1 goldsmith, 48 skilled workers, 2 clerks, 1 notary, 1 cook, and only 3 labourers. And it's interesting to read through those names, but we might come back to that in questions and answers at the end. So we don't know what happened. Why are they imprisoned in York rather than nearer in Beverley or Hull? Is this a display of power and influence? The nearest Neville estate at this period to Beverley, to the East Riding, is Sheriff Hutton. Now, I will hopefully come back to that. I do wonder, because you still see those very impressive gaunt ruins of Sheriff Hutton Castle in the Vale of York if you drive past there. Unfortunately, it's privately owned, so it's closed to the public, though you can walk around it. Sheriff Hutton is, as the crow flies, 40 miles from Beverley, which is the maximum you can ride in the Middle Ages by horseback in a day. So you could get from Sheriff Hutton to Beverley in a day. Get back, I suppose, you'd have to spend the night in Beverley. But those estates, because the Percy family also had the Leconfield estate, which is a bit north of Beverley, so that's a bit closer. Is this some sort of display of the Nevilles that we can strike into Beverley and affect the neighbouring estate of Leconfield versus Sheriff Hutton? I don't know. Now, Beverley and East Yorkshire play another key part in the Wars of the Roses. I've spoken for 45 minutes. I will keep to my word and stop in 15. In 1469, we'll jump around a bit here, when the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, falls out with the now ruling Yorkist King Edward IV and switches support to the exiled Lancastrians. And in the strange sort of turnaround, he will briefly succeed in deposing Edward IV and the House of York, and replace him with the now permanently mentally incapacitated Lancastrian Henry VI, as he is mad. He is a malleable puppet on a string and puppet on a throne, and Richard, Earl of Warwick, has done this just out of complete ambition and jealousy, and he feels that Edward IV is not listening to him. This is a complete power play grab of naked greed and nothing more. There's nothing noble about Warwick, the Kingmaker. He is an opportunist and naught more. To start this coup d'etat, this gets, of course this is going to get confusing. I have to keep checking an encyclopedia to disentangle this. Warwick will engineer 2 rebellions in Yorkshire, one of which will involve Beverley, to strike at a completely trusting and unsuspecting Edward IV and leave the House of York stunned and stupefied, because Warwick has been ever loyal, ever faithful. This is betrayal by your best friend, from Edward IV's point of view. And these are the rebellions of Robin of Holderness and Robin of Redesdale. Robin of Redesdale rebels first appear in the spring of 1469, and they're secretly, behind the scenes, directed by a Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Redesdale is in central Northumberland, it's near Otterburn. It does extend down the Cheviot Hills and gets quite close to County Durham. These uprisings, together with other uprisings which just start to appear out of nowhere throughout Yorkshire and northern England, are intended to spread confusion and disorder throughout the north and then throughout the country. And they are so successful that they still confuse historians today about, how can we disentangle them? Is it one rebellion? Is it several rebellions? Is it an overlap of rebellions? It seems most likely they are ultimately, in fact, all one, but sometimes they just overlap, because they are united by the secret stirring of the Earl of Warwick. In late April 1469, a large body of troublemakers under a mysterious captain, calling himself Robin of Redesdale, or Robin Mend All, was scattered by John Neville, now Earl of Northumberland, Warwick's brother. It gets confusing. The Percys have lost Northumberland because now York's in charge, and he's given the eldom of Northumberland over to the Neville family. But he hasn't killed off the Percy Northumberland because he's trying to bring about peace, which just makes it incredibly confusing because now you have to work out, good grief, whose side is anybody on? It gets so confusing here because Warwick's brother Northumberland's role in this rebellion is uncertain, because Warwick's now turned turncoat. And Warwick may well have been unaware of his brother's plans, and this may well have been just a secret plot to confuse Edward IV. At any rate, Northumberland acts very slowly and allows the Mysterian Robin of Redesdale to escape. In late May or early June, Robin of Redesdale, who we possibly think was Sir William Conyers, a kinsman of Warwick, incited a new uprising and issued a manifesto denouncing Edward IV's government, calling on the king to remove his wicked advisors, especially those of the House of Woodville. This manifesto was presented as a popular petition of the people, but almost certainly had been written by Warwick, for it ominously compared the rule of Edward IV to that of Edward II. Richard II, Henry VI, all kings who had been both deposed and murdered for misgovernment. So as Edward IV marched north to suppress the rebellion, Warwick had cemented an alliance with Edward's treacherous brother, George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, who Shakespeare says that false, fleeting, perjured Clarence in his plays. And Warwick actually arranges for Clarence in mid-July to marry his eldest daughter and heir. By July, both Warwick and Clarence, the brother to the king, so this is Prince Andrew finally sort of turning back on King Charles, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It is like that. And there are some parallels there. But the rebellion begins to gather considerable support, and it begins to outnumber Edward IV's own army, who find themselves camped and stuck at Nottingham, because on July the 26th, Robin marches south and cuts off Edward IV from returning to London. There's a clash with the Yorkist Earl of Pembroke at the Battle of Edgecote, and Pembroke, the Yorkist general there, is defeated and captured, though Robin of Redesdale and many of his rebels also die in the battle. Edwin himself, the Fourth, was forced to surrender to the Earl of Warwick on July the 29th. And now we come on to the Robin of Holderness rebellion, which begins at the same time in May 1469. The Robin of Holderness, the only person we haven't got here is a Robin Hood, isn't it, really? We've got the Robin Mendel, there's Robin of Redesdale, Robin of Holderness. We're going to have another Robin in a moment. This was essentially an armed protest against a tax levied on the landowners of northern England by St Leonard's Hospital in York, a bit similar to the Beverley Minster claiming a frave of corn from everybody in the East Riding. Well, for the past 100 years, and it doesn't develop until the late 13th century, St Leonard's Hospital in York, by York Reference Library, the ruins you see there in the museum gardens, claimed a frave, i.e. 24 sheaves of grain every year from every parish in the East Riding. Now, following the clear lead of Sir William Conyers, who had timed this uprising to coincide with the Redesdale rebellion, a Robert Hilliard of Beverley appears on the scene, who's a tenant of the Lancastrian Percy family. And it appears that he, according to one chronicler, took on the name Robin of Holderness and led the tax protesters towards York. Before reaching their destination, the Holderness rebels were dispersed by John Neville, Earl of Northumberland, who seized Robin and executed him before the gates of York City. Thus, although some Holderness rebels may have later joined the Redesdale rebellion, the former was apparently unrelated to the latter. However, both were clearly part of Warwick's plan to seize control of the government. The only contemporary account of the Holderness Rising claims that the rebels sought to restore the Lancastrian Henry Percy, then languishing in the Tower of London as Earl of Northumberland. I told you he had been stripped of that title by Edward IV and had been given to John Neville, which would explain why John Neville so effectively suppresses this rebellion and leaves nobody alive. What is even more confusing about this entire affair is even though the Robert Hilliard, who's meant to be Robin of Holderness, is executed in 1469, there is another Robert Hilliard of Beverley in 1470 who appears about 6 months after his apparent execution. Now, although there may well have been two Robert Hilliards, I suppose it's not impossible, it could be that the entire persona of Robin of Holderness has been fabricated by Warwick or his brother Northumberland to convince Edward IV that the latter was a loyal subject, even while the former was engaged in treason. Robert Hilliard, too, is recorded as submitting himself to the king at York in March 1470. And 4 days later, Edward IV grants Percy the earldom of Northumberland, and in an attempt to try to bring him back on board and patch up this quarrel, but obviously he's got to do something with Neville, so he makes John Neville now the Marquis of Montagu, the first creation of a marquis in England, a technically higher title. Unfortunately, from the king's point of view, it doesn't actually carry much land because they've only just invented it. But we'll deal with that later. So you can be bribed off, but we'll make you a marquis. Surely that's something the French do, but actually it's now just been brought into England. I suppose his wife will become a marchioness. Now, I'm moving towards the end because I'm going to sort of talk slightly differently now about one of Beverley's greatest, often overlooked sons, who was born and rose to power throughout this period, John Alcock, who was born in Beverley in circa 1430 and was educated at Beverley Grammar School and subsequently at Cambridge University. Given his astonishingly successful career, we really should have a statue of him in either Wednesday or Saturday Market. In 1461, he became Dean of St. Stephen's Chapel, Westminster. In 1462, Royal Master of the Rolls, and in 1470, England's ambassador to the Crown Court of Castile in Spain. March 15, 1472, he was consecrated Bishop of Rochester, and then on July the 15th, 1476, made Bishop of Worcester, and in October the 4th, 1486, was made Bishop of Ely. He was the first president of the Council of the Marches in Wales, from 1473 to his death in 1500, and twice held the office of Lord Chancellor of England, the King's chief minister, in 1475 and 1485 to 1489. He was both a leading theologian of the day and also, interestingly, by his own merit, an architect who went around designing all the buildings that he founded. It's very possible he actually put the designs for Hull Grammar School together. He founded an educational charity, a series of scholarships in Beverley, and they were attached to Beverley Minster and to St. Mary's. He founded and endowed Hull Grammar School. He restored many churches and colleges, but his greatest achievement was the building of Jesus College, Cambridge, which he established on the site of the former convent of St. Radegund. Most interesting of all, though, Alcock was trusted and favoured by successive English kings, by Edward IV, Richard III, and also by Henry VII. Very few people could have claimed to stay in with the king and three so differing in their nature and in their politics. But now I'm getting to the very juicy bit, which I'm going to end with. I'm still on due to hit the 6 o'clock schedule, because John Alcock was appointed by King Edward IV as the personal tutor to his eldest son, King Edward V, the older prince in the Tower. After the death of Edward IV, Alcock was briefly arrested and removed from office by who? By Richard, Duke of Gloucester. But within a month or two, he was quickly released and reinstated. And he was with King Richard III when he entered York in August 1483. Later, Bishop Alcock was one of several clerics who openly canvassed the idea that Henry Tudor should marry Elizabeth of York. Henry VII made him again Lord Chancellor. He opens Henry VII's first Parliament on December 7, 1485, and became one of Henry's most trusted servants. So if anyone might know what really did happen to the princes in the Tower in 1483, it may well have been that Bishop John Alcock did. We don't really have time to go into the details, events of the Third War of the Wars of the Roses in the 1480s. But suffice to say that all of Yorkshire is now firmly under the control of the House of York, and Gloucester has now become King Richard III, and he is known even prior to that as the King in the North. What happened to the two princes in the Tower is probably the most famously contested debate of medieval England. Were they killed? Did they die naturally? Did they die together of a disease or a plague in the Tower of London by a damp, dank tower by the river? Did they escape? If they were killed, who killed them? Or gave the orders for them to be killed? Was it Richard III? Was it the Duke of Buckingham, who is a very highly plausible candidate and somebody who may well have done this? Was it Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor? Or was it Henry Tudor himself? All I'm going to say is that when it comes to what happened to the princes in the Tower, I think we are asking the wrong question. The question we should be asking is, why is it that, especially during an age of faith, King Edward V is the only English king ever in all of history not to have a Christian burial or a Christian funeral. Even unpopular, deposed, murdered kings, such as Edward II, Richard II, Henry VI, all received a Christian burial and funeral. And even if he is a murderer, Richard III himself was buried with a Christian funeral in a Franciscan monastery in Leicester, which we now know as a car park, where X does mark the spot. Because I think it was Bay 10 they found him in, wasn't it? The only reason I can think of why Edward V has this unique position of not being buried is because for some reason no dead body could ever be produced. My talk was entitled Unwelcome, Neighbours and Unwanted Challenges, but it has largely focused on the impact of the War of the Roses and Beverley and Yorkshire's involvement in key pivotal moments during the 15th century. There was, however, another unwelcome neighbour, creating challenges that the people of Beverley would be unable to answer, and that is the rise of Kingston upon Hull. By the accession of the Tudor dynasty in 1485, Hull has effectively placed a complete stranglehold on the trade of Beverley merchants, and the decline of the town would now be openly apparent even to those visiting it as pilgrims or as traders. And in 1520, it will have a final disaster, which during a service, the tower of St. Mary's Church will collapse on its congregation. But therein, at 6 o'clock precisely, I end my talk.